All right. I'm calling this meeting of the regularly scheduled Committee of the Whole to order. My name is Elizabeth Glidden. I am the chair of this committee, and I am joined today by council members Cano, Bender, Andrew Johnson, Yang, Quincy, and Fry, and we are a quorum of this committee. We do have a very full agenda today. It includes 4 items. Including our awaited results of a study on a minimum wage increase. And that item will come up a little bit later in the agenda. Our first item of business, however, is a public hearing on the classified service ordinance. This is an action that we are taking subsequent to the council's previous action to remove the Rule of 3 language from the city charter a few months ago. And so I'm going to invite up, I believe Ms. Ferguson is going to give us an overview report of the ordinance that would then essentially replace the language that had been in the charter, and then we'll open the public hearing. Thank you very much, Ms. Ferguson.
Thank you, Vice President Glidden, members of the Committee of the Whole. On May 4th, 2016, the Charter Commission approved a proposal to amend the city charter to eliminate the Rule of 3 in hiring decisions and authorizing the City Council to adopt an appropriate ordinance regarding hiring procedures. On July 26, 2016, the Minneapolis City Council amended the city charter to eliminate the Rule of 3 language from the charter. The provision allows for the council to establish modern procedures by ordinance and, in addition, directed the Human Resources Department to draft an ordinance amending Title II, Chapter 20 of the Minneapolis Code of Ordinance relating to administration personnel. A draft ordinance was drafted, and it contains the guiding principles used for selection processes. We engaged a variety of methods to engage the various stakeholders, including the labor representatives. We've had 3 meetings with them. We also had an additional conversation with them this week. We engaged the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board, the Civil Service Commission, and we also reviewed the proposed draft ordinance with the city coordinator as well as with the city attorney's office. Revisions to the draft ordinance were made based on stakeholder feedback. And so the proposed ordinance, which you have in front of you, calls for merit-based procedures for assessing applicants and filling vacancies in the classified service. The procedures are based on sound human resource principles, which support the values and goals of the city of Minneapolis, are based on bona fide job qualifications, seek to eliminate personal and/or institutional bias in hiring decisions, include measures that promote continuous improvement in the hiring process, and result in an eligibility register consisting of a pool of qualified candidates. If applicable, collective bargaining agreements contain a different procedure. The procedure in the applicable collective bargaining agreement shall be followed by the City of Minneapolis. The Human Resources Department recommends the adoption of the ordinance before you.
All right. Thank you very much for that presentation. For council members, I'm still getting into my computer system, so I don't have speaker management up yet in case anyone has clarifying questions. And I'll just note as well that we have been joined by council members Gordon, Wright, and Palmisano. And so thank you to them for being here as well. So I'm not seeing any clarifying questions from council members. So our next step is to open the public hearing. And we will ask, and you may go ahead and take a seat.
Thank you.
And we can ask if there is anyone here who wishes to speak to this proposed ordinance. And we had not received any advance notice of anybody. Oh, Mr. Michaels. And if you would just introduce yourself, please.
I will. Madam Chair, council members, my name is Jim Michaels. I'm a labor representative, represent 3 bargaining units in the city of Minneapolis, the Police Federation, Firefighters Local 82, and also the Public Works Engineers. As you probably are aware, the issue of the Rule of 3 has been something that has been talked about between several levels of the city's leadership and the labor unions for the better part of probably 15 to 20 years. We remain a partner in trying to advance the goals of the city, and the fact that the ordinance now is replacing what was in the charter is something that we've already started the process of talking with Mr. Giles and with Ms. Ferguson about how to implement those things in a way that will be collaborative and in the best interests of everyone. The primary goal, and I just speak for my bargaining units, I can't speak for all of labor, although, you know, the Board of Business Agents has obviously discussed this issue several times as well. The main interest, I would say, is that that among the goals that we advance would be hiring the best qualified people for the job. We understand that one of the problems with the rule of three may have been that it was kind of a one-size-fits-all approach. And there may be a significant difference in the way that you might hire a professional engineer from the way you might hire a clerk typist or a fire captain. And I think that that's one of the things that this ordinance will give us the flexibility to try and find those approaches. In an initial conversation that labor representatives, including myself, had with Tim Giles a couple of weeks ago, Tim actually came up with an idea that all of labor really supported, and that was to create a subgroup of the Citywide Labor Management Committee. Tim's idea was to call it the HP LMC, which is Hiring and Promotion LMC, not something that would make printers or computers. But the HP LMC would function quite similar to the Benefits Labor Management Committee, or the BLMC, which I think has an outstanding track record of collaborative work that's saved the city employees and the taxpayers of the city literally millions of dollars. So using that model, I think that was a good vehicle for us to have the types of discussions that would implement the ordinance, assist HR in coming up with the policies that would fulfill the scope of the ordinance. So my main purpose in addressing you this morning is just to let all of you know that the devil is always in the details, but at least as where we stand right now, whatever controversy or concerns there may have been with labor about the manner in which the charter was amended, we're setting those aside and we're moving forward, and we look forward in working with the HR staff of coming up with something that serves the best interests of everyone. Because the one thing that we all have in common, regardless of which avenue gets us to the table, is the desire to do good work and to serve the people who live, work, and play in the city of Minneapolis as best as we can. So we will find a way to work through this. And like I said, I just wanted to have the check-in with you to let you know. And we do ask for your support of the HP LMC as a model to continue those discussions. It's not a substitute for collective bargaining. To the extent that some of the processes involve collective bargaining, that will be handled at the bargaining table. But in just coming up with guidelines and best practices and those types of things, I think it's good to include labor in those discussions, because a lot of times we can come up with something that is helpful to everybody, as witnessed by the BLMC. So that's all I really wanted to say. I'll be happy to answer any questions if there are any, but I just wanted to take this opportunity to kind of input you from at least 3 labor units' perspective on this issue.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Michaels. I really appreciate you took your time to be here. I'm not seeing questions for you. I will ask if there is anyone else who would like to speak as part of the public hearing. Anyone else who would like to speak as part of the public hearing on the classified service ordinance? I'm not seeing anyone. So I will go ahead and close the public hearing. Again, we have in front of us this ordinance that replaces the mechanism that used to be called the Rule of Three that was utilized in the city charter. I'm going to go ahead and move approval of the ordinance, and like just to make a couple comments of appreciation again to what I think has been a very good staff team that has worked on this, and I think also, as we see from Mr. Michaels being here and taking his time to let us know about the process from his perspective, that it was done so in a manner that really engaged labor and our Board of Business Agents. And I think that was also a message that came from the council, is that we wanted to make sure those relationships were valued as we move forward in this new way of doing business. So anyone else? Discussion? Councilmember Gordon?
Thank you very much. I'm certainly supportive of this. I also like the idea of a HPLMC, and I'm not sure if HR department needs any direction or anything like that, but I think if it makes sense for them to set that up. I know that the citywide labor management committee is meeting, I think, later today. So maybe that's an issue that they could also take up and make sure that everybody in that room is supportive of it. But I just thought I'd take this opportunity to speak here, saying that sounds like a really good idea. And I think the more working together, the more communication we can have, and whatever makes sense to the citywide labor management team, I'm certainly willing to support that. And so I appreciate Mr. Michaels bringing that forward.
Thank you, Councilmember Gordon. And I'll just, maybe that's a question of Ms. Ferguson. My understanding is that there would not need to be a direction from the council to do that type of work together between staff and labor. It kind of, again, follows the model of the benefits committee, which I don't believe had a council direction setting that. It was something that was agreed upon between those stakeholders and has been very, very helpful. Any other discussion on the ordinance? Not seeing any, so all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? And that item is approved. Thank you very, very much. Next, we have a brief consent item, which is passage of a resolution directing employees, elected officials, and members of city boards and commissions to watch the political activity ethics video. And this, again, is a consent item. I will move approval. Any discussion? Seeing none, all in approval, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? And that item is approved. Now we are to an item that I know has been eagerly awaited. This is a presentation on the results of a study evaluating a minimum wage increase in Minneapolis and Hennepin County, Ramsey County. And I believe Mr. Frank, there he is, David Frank was going to give us an overview introduction and then help introduce the speakers who conducted the study.
That's right.
Mr. Frank.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Madam Chair and committee members. I'm David Frank from CPED, and we, your staff team, are here together with Dr. Samuel Myers and his team to present the results of the study of a minimum wage increase in Minneapolis and in Hennepin and Ramsey County. Just a quick recap of how we got here based on your direction. In April of 2015, the City Council passed a Supporting a Strong Economy and Working Families resolution, which directed staff to develop a recommendation for the study of the effects of establishing a minimum wage regionally and locally, and to develop the funding and the development of that study no later than third quarter of 2015. In September of 2015, the City Council authorized issuance of a request for proposals for comprehensive economic analysis of a citywide minimum wage increase, and separately the impacts of a minimum wage increase in Hennepin and Ramsey County. And then this February of 2016, City Council authorized a contract for Minneapolis minimum wage increase study to be conducted by the competitively selected research team consisting of representatives from the University of Minnesota, Howard University, Rutgers University, and the Economic Policy Institute. The scope of the study was to examine the impacts of a minimum wage increase in the city of Minneapolis and in Hennepin and Ramsey County. The study looked at an increase to $12 and to $15 each phased in over 5 years. The research team, as I say, led by the Roy Wilkins Center at the University of Minnesota, reviewed existing peer-reviewed literature on minimum wage changes and replicated techniques prevalent in other studies to evaluate a minimum wage increase in Minneapolis and in Hennepin and Ramsey County. As you will hear, the study found that of the city's 311,000 workers, 47,000 would be affected by an increase to $12 per hour minimum wage, and 71,000 would be affected by an increase to $15 an hour minimum wage. The study also found that workers of color would disproportionately benefit from a minimum wage increase. Even though 2/3 of the total workforce in the city is white, half of the workforce affected by a $15 minimum wage is white. Latino and Black workers are more likely to be affected than others. And I should point out, too, that service industries like restaurants, retail, fast food, healthcare, and childcare are where minimum wage work is concentrated and where the benefits and the impacts will be felt most strongly by both employees and employers. A quick thanks to some of my colleagues, and then I will introduce the researchers. Thank you to many of you and your offices, to the mayor's office, and most especially my colleagues, Mark Brinda, Andrew Dahl, Sasha Bergman, Nuria Rivera-Vandermeide, Jeff Schneider, Greta Bergstrom, and Sarah McKenzie. And I will switch presentations here. There it is. I'd like to introduce Thomas Durfee, researcher at the Roy Wilkins Center at the University of Minnesota, who will introduce the rest of the research team and step us through the minimum wage study. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Frank. Mr. Durfee.
Thank you very much, and good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair, for inviting us to present the findings of our report today. We'd also like to thank the City Council for listening to our findings, and we would like to also thank Councilwoman Cano for making the request for proposal known to us. Today, I'm going to be outlining the key findings of our minimum wage simulation study. Our team has a series of economists and researchers who advised the project. Dr. Sam Myers acted as the principal investigator for the project. Dr. William Spriggs acted as an economic advisor. We also had Dr. Monica Garcia Perez from St. Cloud State University acting as an economic advisor. Dr. William Rogers is not able to be here today. However, he gave economic advice with respect to food security and the response to food security after an increase in the minimum wage. We also had David Cooper from the Economic Policy Institute provide economic policy analysis as well as demographic analysis for our simulation. We also had a team of researchers, including Yufeng Lai, Juliette Santamaria, Manzu, and myself. The purpose of this presentation today is to inform the public of the findings of our recent simulation. The goals of this presentation is going to be to establish a baseline of what the changes of the what changes from this minimum wage would look like, to explain what we did in our simulation, and to highlight some of the key findings of our report. First, looking at the size of the affected workforce, as David Frank mentioned, the projected size of the Minneapolis workforce in the year 2021 is 311,000. We're using 2021 as our comparison year because the simulation that we employed assumes an incremental increase in the current minimum wage using the Minnesota minimum wage as a baseline, and then increasing until the minimum wage reaches either $15 or $12 by 2021. We find that 46,000 members of the Minneapolis workforce would be affected by a $12 minimum wage and 71,000 by a $15 minimum wage. The earnings effects that we have simulated range from 6 to 16% for $12 and from 13 to 31% for a $15 minimum wage. One clarification that is important to make is that the earnings simulated by the Roy Wilkins Center reflect quarterly earnings, not hourly earnings. So any changes that we represent today would represent changes not just in an hourly rate, but in actual income that is brought home by households. Next, we found that after simulating many different models for the effect of employment in response to a minimum wage, we found that there was little statistically significant evidence of the change of a minimum wage. Finally, we modeled the business responses to changes in the minimum wage, highlighting there are many different ways which businesses may respond, but highlighted for the sake of these key findings, we find that operational costs would have an upper bound of around 2% for a $12 minimum wage and 5.4% for a $15 minimum wage. Again, this is in the year 2021 when the policy is set to simulated to finish. In order to explain the context for the simulated minimum wage, we first have to establish what the current minimum wage is. And the problem is that there are actually several minimum wages that are operating for Minneapolis residents right now, not just a single one. The current minimum wage is $9.50 an hour for employees who work at firms that are earning more than $500,000 a year in gross sales receipts. Small firms are then required under the same under earning less than $500,000 to pay $7.75 an hour. And small firms that after there are 82% of firms in the Minneapolis area that are eligible to pay this lower rate. However, it should be noted that just because a firm is eligible to pay a lower rate does not require them to do so, and indeed many firms choose to pay a higher rate regardless. We also find that in the Hennepin and Ramsey area, there is a similar distribution of large and small firms. Finally, the federal minimum wage follows a similar design as the Minnesota state minimum wage, however, is at a lower rate. Both have a commensurate wage component, which allow employers to receive special certification to then pay individuals who have disabilities which affect their productivity to then be paid a different rate. But again, that requires certification. The reason why I bring up this distinction is because in comparing the minimum wage changes that we have observed in the past and used as the basis for our simulation, we see a few key points. First off, we simulate going forward a change from the $9.50 minimum wage up until $12 and $15 by 2021 for large firms. We also then simulate a proportional increase of the small firm minimum wage, which would imply a $9.79 small firm minimum wage and a $12.24 small firm minimum wage for the $12 and $15 rates, respectively. There are also a few things that are apparent when indexing changes in the minimum wage to inflation, which is what we have done in this slide. First, by looking at the $12 minimum wage, which is simulated by the yellow line, we find that in real terms, this minimum wage is precedented. It has, there were similar minimum wage rates in the late 60s and early 70s. Likewise, we find that the small firm minimum wage that is corresponding to that $12 minimum wage rate is similar to the current large firm minimum wage rate for the entirety of Minnesota. Again, that was $9.79 as opposed to $9.50 for today's rate. So when we mentioned earlier that there are 46 to 71,000 workers that would be affected by this policy, it is worthwhile to mention what we mean by the word affected. In this simulation, we first take a look at earnings, which again is defined quarterly, which allows for the possibility that although working hours may go down in a given quarter, again, if there are positive results, which we find, it would be that decrease in hours would be offset by an increase in the wage rate. We find that the simulations that we ran generally found an increase in earnings of between 10 to 30%. We also find that the increases are highest in the restaurant industry. There's also relatively high in the retail industry, and that most other industries do not have a prevalence of workers earning the minimum wage large enough to make a statistically significantly large simulation. I'm sorry. It looks like there was a slide that was missed. I will go back for a moment to the who would earn less than $12 and $15, the demographic component of our analysis. So in order to explain who earns the minimum wage and who would be affected by these changes in the minimum wage, the Roy Wilkins Center used a mixture of census data and data from the Metropolitan Council. And when we did this, we found a few interesting findings. As David Frank alluded to earlier, we find that there would be about 1/3 of African American and 1/3 of Latino and Latina workers would be earning under $12 an hour in 2021 were it not for this policy. So the increase of the minimum wage would then affect this population. We also find that half of the workers earning under $12 or $15 in the year 2021 would be American Indians and persons of color. So again, that would be representative of about 53% of those groups. We also find that although a lot of attention is given during minimum wage discussions to teenage workers, that actually 2/3 of the workforce who would be earning less than $12 or $15 in 2021, were it not for this policy, are actually above the age of 25. Continuing on this thread, not only are these workers likely to be above the age of 25, but we also find that of the minimum wage earning workforce, that 3/4 of this workforce are not currently in schooling. To be clear, in schooling is defined as either being in high school or in some kind of post-secondary program, some kind of college or university. It would not include professional certification programs like, for example, the Aveda Institute. Also, 3/5 of workers earning below $15 do at least have some degree of college, either some college, an associate's degree, or have a college-level bachelor's education. What's more, we find that in 2021, half of the workers earning below $15 are already working full-time being defined as 35 hours a week. Finally, we find that the restaurant, retail, and specifically non-hospital component of the healthcare sector have the highest prevalence of minimum wage earning workers and workers below $12 and $15. Given that I went over earnings already, I will go to employment now. When we simulated the changes in employment in response to a minimum wage, first off, we define employment as the number of persons who are employed in a certain industry, in a certain area. So it is an employment level. Second, most of the models that we used to simulate this increase in the minimum wage do not have an identifiable change in employment, which means historically, after changes in the minimum wage, it cannot be said that there is a clear causal reduction in employment that can be said to be caused by the minimum wage. There are a series of responses that we have simulated for how businesses would respond to a change in the minimum wage. First, as mentioned earlier, there would be an increase in operational costs. We find that this would be anywhere from less than 0.1% to 5.4% at most, and we define this as a change in labor cost that then gets translated into the share of total operational costs. So this is entire accounting operational costs that we find would have a 5.4% upper bound with the $15 minimum wage. However, the changes in, there is evidence, however, that firms do not simply change their payrolls in response to a minimum wage, that there's also some changes in their workforce that they employ, particularly in the way that they employ them. We find that there's a reduction in turnover, specifically quarterly turnover, which is defined as when an employee works at a certain location, at a certain business, and then continues to work at that same location 3 months later. So we find there's a reduction in turnover, which means that there are fewer people who are no longer at the same position. That means that there are more people who are still within the same position, relatively speaking, after a change to the minimum wage than there would be before. We also find that this turnover helps fight vacancy. One simulation that we studied brought up specifically the restaurant and retail industries in a hotel chain and found that filling the associated cost of filling a vacant position in turnover was approximately $2,000 until they get that position filled. And in reducing the turnover rate, then we simulate the change in the minimum wage would then cause a decrease in the number of positions that would be turning over. One difficult thing to interpret about this reduction in turnover rate is that there is a cost saving associated with this. However, this cost saving does not get realized in a normal balance sheet because it is the avoidance of someone not being in a position, so the counterfactual doesn't show up on a budget sheet, whereas an increase in the minimum wage would. However, the cost savings is still measurable. We also find that there is evidence that businesses may respond by changing prices in response to a minimum wage. We focused specifically on the restaurant industry because we find the restaurant industry to be to have the highest propensity for being affected by changes in the minimum wage. Again, speaking to 2021, if one was sitting in a restaurant and ordered a $25 meal in the year 2021 and turned on a light and created a $12 minimum wage that had happened as we had simulated over the 5 years previously, it would lead to an increase in menu prices of only about $1.11. For a $15 minimum wage, the cost increase for that same meal would be $1.66. This is accounting for inflation. Now, this increase in price happens for a few reasons. Largely, it is because 51% of the costs that are associated with an increase in the minimum wage are passable onto consumers. And when it is passed on to consumers, it then allows the cost of the minimum wage to be spread out amongst consumers rather than being burdened entirely by the business owners. We also find that this is something that is capable, or that is possible at a certain time, because all restaurants then are subject to the same minimum wage change at the same time. This particular study was looking at a specific geographical area, so there were no competitive issues because all restaurants had to raise their prices if they chose to in response to the same minimum wage at the same time, and there was not an issue of competition there. So to, again, summarize, what we've found is that by the end of the simulated policy, we find between 46 to 71,000 workers in Minneapolis would be affected by the proposed policies. We find that there are largely 10 to 30% increases in earnings, and we find that there is little statistical evidence that there would be a change in the employment level in response to the proposed minimum wages. Thank you.
I'm sure are you going to answer questions, or did you want others?
We have the entire team here, so we will be able to field questions. Okay. We have different specialties, and we can respond according to who is best equipped to answer your questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation. As you can see, who are paying very close attention. Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I did have a question on this last slide, in particular about restaurant workers. As the study noted, this is the biggest proportion of workers that are earning minimum wage now, so it's important, I think, for us to understand this piece. Could you talk more about how you estimated these, what I would consider pretty moderate increases in price in restaurants that would be phased in over 5 years? I know you talked about the methodology a bit, but just kind of for the layperson to understand, was this based on experiences from other jurisdictions that have raised the wage, or is it more of a economic theory approach to understanding what we expect we might see in restaurant prices?
Sure. Thank you very much. And I can speak to this. And David, if you have anything that you'd like to add on to it, you can follow me up after this. So the research that we did comes from a group who was looking at a county in California that changed the minimum wage. This group studied the change in prices before and after a minimum wage change, and they sliced that study a few different ways. They looked at full service restaurants versus partial service restaurants, or non-full service restaurants, fast food restaurants, chains versus non-chains, and the size of restaurants based off of their head count, whether or not how many employees did this restaurant have. Then after the minimum wage occurred in this county, they followed the change in price, and they used econometric techniques to try and measure how much of the price change was responsible because of the minimum wage. And what they find is it's a relatively small change in menu prices, and this is because the change in menu prices is spread out amongst the entire consumer base, and that consumers are willing to pay less than $2 for an increase in a $25 meal, that restaurants were able to raise those prices in order to accommodate those costs. Do you have anything you would like to add?
If you would come up, just because we're recording this and then others who are watching can hear you.
So I'm David Cooper. I'm a researcher at the Economic Policy Institute. The study that Thomas referenced measured the price response in menu prices from a minimum wage increase that actually took effect. It measured what the actual price changes were. At the same time, we also simulated what the increase in the total wage bill would be from a $12 or a $15 minimum wage in Minneapolis, took that total, said if you assume no change in the hours that folks work, in the way that the business responds to that increase in labor costs, just took that entire labor cost and then took what labor is as a share of total operating costs for restaurants, multiply the two together, you get what the change in total operating costs is. And our simulated values were right in line with what that study that Thomas referenced showed. So we are fairly confident that even in our simulation, we're getting results that are very similar to what was found in real life when a similar increase took effect.
All right, Yep, go ahead, Councilmember Bender. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have one more sort of broader question, which is, if I think back to my economics classes long ago, we talked about the export economy versus the local economy, and it's not always a perfect separation, but you think of the export economy as being that which creates the bulk of the jobs or economic growth in a region versus, the pharmacy or the local store that folks kind of need to get stuff from. And that's changing in lots of ways. But it struck me that the three industries where we expect to see the biggest impact because wages are the lowest now tend to be in the industries that are more of our local economy, our restaurants, our retail stores, and our healthcare industry. And again, you could consider restaurants as part of our tourism economy. Maybe people are traveling here because of our excellent healthcare. But could you talk more about that dynamic and what it means that we don't see things like manufacturing or tech or some of these large, sort of what I would think of as our export economy in this list